Chapter 1. The Town of Crimson Gulch. To understand the horror that would come to Crimson Gulch, we must first understand the town itself, and we must understand the man who protected it. Crimson Gulch was established in 1871, during the height of the Colorado Silver Rush. The town earned its name from the distinctive red rock formations that surrounded it, towering canyon walls that seemed to bleed in the afternoon sun. The gulch itself was a natural fortress, accessible only through a narrow pass that could be easily defended. By 1885, Crimson Gulch had grown into a thriving settlement of nearly 3,000 people. There were saloons and gambling halls. There were general stores and trading posts. There were families who had built lives in that remote corner of Colorado, seeking opportunity and finding community. But like all frontier towns, Crimson Gulch had its dark side. Outlaws passed through regularly. Claim disputes turned violent. Disputes over water rights and mining territories led to bloodshed. The town needed law and order. The town needed a sheriff. That's where Thomas Blackwood came in. Blackwood arrived in Crimson Gulch in 1878, a man in his early 40s with a reputation that preceded him. He'd been a Texas Ranger. He'd tracked outlaws across 3 states. He'd faced down gunfighters and lived to tell about it. He was exactly what Crimson Gulch needed. For 7 years, Sheriff Thomas Blackwood maintained order in Crimson Gulch. He was fair but firm. He was respected by the townspeople and feared by the criminals who passed through. Under his watch, violent crime in Crimson Gulch dropped dramatically. The town prospered. Families felt safe. Children could play in the streets without fear. But Blackwood had enemies, powerful enemies, enemies he'd made during his years as a ranger, enemies he'd arrested, enemies he'd testified against, enemies who'd sworn revenge. In the spring of 1885, those enemies came calling. A gang of outlaws, led by a man named Victor Crane, rode into Crimson Gulch with a specific purpose: to kill Sheriff Thomas Blackwood. Crane had spent 5 years in prison because of Blackwood's testimony. 5 years in a cell thinking about revenge. 5 years planning what he would do when he finally got his chance. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday afternoon in the main street of Crimson Gulch. Blackwood was making his rounds, checking on the town, when he saw Crane and his men riding toward him. There were 5 of them, hardened criminals, experienced gunfighters. Blackwood was alone. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He stood in the middle of the street, his hand resting on his revolver, and he waited. What happened next would become legend in Crimson Gulch. The gunfight lasted less than 3 minutes, but in those 3 minutes, something extraordinary occurred. Blackwood, outnumbered 5-1, managed to draw and fire with such speed and accuracy that he shot 3 of the outlaws dead before they even got off a single shot. But Crane was faster than the others. Crane's bullet caught Blackwood in the chest. Blackwood fell to his knees, blood spreading across his shirt. He managed to get off one more shot, wounding Crane in the shoulder, but it wasn't enough to stop him. Crane stood over the dying sheriff, his revolver pointed at Blackwood's head. The townspeople watched from behind closed doors and windows, too terrified to intervene. Crane smiled. He raised his gun to deliver the final shot. But before he could, the sky above Crimson Gulch went dark, not gradually, as if a storm was approaching, but suddenly, completely, as if someone had thrown a switch and extinguished the sun. And then the crows came. Hundreds of them, thousands of them, a massive flock of black birds descended from the sky like a living cloud. They attacked Crane and his remaining men with a fury that seemed almost purposeful. The birds clawed at their faces, pecked at their eyes, drove them into a panic. Crane dropped his gun and ran, screaming, his hands over his face. His men scattered, fleeing in different directions. The crows pursued them, relentless, driving them out of town and into the surrounding desert. When the sky cleared, when the sun returned, the crows were gone, and Sheriff Thomas Blackwood was dead. The townspeople rushed out into the street and found Blackwood lying in the dust, his life slowly draining away. He was conscious, barely, and he managed to speak one final time. According to witnesses, his last words were, "They'll pay. I swear it. Even death won't stop me. They'll all pay." Thomas Blackwood was buried in the Crimson Gulch Cemetery on a Friday afternoon. The entire town attended his funeral. The preacher spoke of his service, his sacrifice, his dedication to justice. They lowered his coffin into the ground and covered it with earth. Everyone assumed that was the end of the story. Everyone assumed that Thomas Blackwood would finally rest. Everyone was wrong.
Chapter 2. The Resurrection. 3 nights after Thomas Blackwood was buried, something impossible happened in the Crimson Gulch Cemetery. A man named Jacob Pritchard was passing by the graveyard on his way home from the saloon. He was drunk, unsteady on his feet, but he was still coherent enough to see what happened next. What he witnessed that night would haunt him for the rest of his life. According to Pritchard's account, given to the town doctor the next morning, he saw Blackwood's grave begin to move. The earth above the coffin started to shift and settle, as if something was pushing from below. Pritchard, terrified, tried to run, but he found himself paralyzed, unable to move, forced to watch as the impossible unfolded before him. The coffin lid burst open from the inside. Blackwood's body rose from the grave, covered in dirt, his clothes torn and stained with blood. But something was different about the body. Something was wrong. Blackwood's eyes were black, completely black. No whites, no pupils, just solid black orbs that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And his skin had taken on a grayish hue, like something that had been dead far longer than 3 days. But most disturbing of all were the crows. They emerged from the grave alongside Blackwood, dozens of them, hundreds of them. They perched on his shoulders, his arms, his head. They seemed to be part of him somehow, as if they were extensions of his will rather than separate creatures. Blackwood looked at Pritchard, and Pritchard felt something break inside him. He felt the weight of that gaze, the intelligence behind those black eyes. He felt the presence of something vast and terrible looking at him through Blackwood's corpse. And then Blackwood spoke, but his voice wasn't his own. It was layered, as if multiple voices were speaking simultaneously. It was the voice of something ancient, something hungry, something that had been waiting for a vessel through which to speak. According to Pritchard's account, given to the town doctor the next morning, Blackwood said, "Justice is not finished. The debt is not paid. The guilty will be punished. The innocent will be protected, and I will be the instrument of that punishment." Then Blackwood turned and walked out of the cemetery, the crows swirling around him like a living cloak. Pritchard watched until the figure disappeared into the darkness. Then he ran. He ran all the way to the doctor's office and collapsed on the steps, babbling incoherently about the dead rising and the crows and the black eyes. The doctor, Dr. Samuel Whitmore, initially dismissed Pritchard's account as the ravings of a drunk man. But then other reports began to come in. People throughout Crimson Gulch reported seeing a figure walking through the streets at night, a figure that looked like Sheriff Blackwood, but wrong somehow, a figure surrounded by crows, a figure that seemed to be watching the town, observing it, judging it. More disturbing were the reports of what happened to the outlaws who'd killed Blackwood. Victor Crane, the man who'd shot the sheriff, had fled Crimson Gulch after the initial gunfight. He'd ridden east toward the New Mexico territory, hoping to put as much distance as possible between himself and the town. But Crane never made it to New Mexico. His body was found 3 days later, about 20 miles from Crimson Gulch, in a remote canyon. He was dead, completely dead. His body was covered in wounds, hundreds of them, claw marks and peck marks, as if he'd been attacked by a massive flock of birds. His eyes had been completely destroyed, pecked out of his skull. His face was unrecognizable. But the most disturbing detail was what was found in Crane's hands. He was clutching a piece of paper. On that paper, written in blood, was a single word: guilty. The other outlaws who'd ridden with Crane met similar fates. One was found in a ravine, his body broken, surrounded by crow feathers. Another was discovered in an abandoned cabin, dead of what appeared to be a heart attack, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The third was never found, but his horse was discovered wandering the desert, its saddle empty, its reins trailing behind it. The townspeople of Crimson Gulch began to understand what was happening. They began to realize that something had returned from the dead.
something that was settling scores, something that was dispensing justice in a way that transcended the boundaries between life and death. And then the killings began in earnest. There was a man named Samuel Garrett, a prospector who'd been involved in a claim-jumping dispute that had turned violent. A man had died in that dispute, a man named Robert Hayes. Hayes's death had been ruled an accident, but everyone in town knew the truth. Garrett had killed him over a silver claim. Garrett was found dead in his cabin, hanged from the rafters. But he hadn't hanged himself. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, nothing to suggest suicide. It was as if Garrett had simply stood there while an invisible force wrapped a noose around his neck and lifted him into the air. And like Crane, Garrett was clutching a piece of paper. On it, written in blood, "Guilty." Then came the case of Martha Sinclair. Martha had been accused of poisoning her husband, but the charges were dropped due to lack of evidence. Everyone in town knew she'd done it. Everyone knew she'd slowly poisoned him over months, draining his bank account and waiting for him to die so she could run away with his money. Martha was found in her home, dead in her bed. No marks on her body, no signs of violence, but her face was twisted in agony, and her mouth was filled with crow feathers. The autopsy revealed that she'd been poisoned, the same poison she'd used on her husband. And yes, she too was clutching a piece of paper. Guilty. The pattern became clear. Sheriff Thomas Blackwood, or whatever he'd become, was moving through Crimson Gulch and identifying those who'd committed crimes that had gone unpunished. Those who'd escaped justice through corruption, through lack of evidence, through the simple failure of the legal system to catch them. And he was killing them. But he wasn't killing them randomly. He was killing them in ways that reflected their crimes. The poisoner poisoned, the claim jumper hanged, the murderers torn apart by crows. It was justice, but it was a justice that transcended the law. A justice that was personal, brutal, and absolute.
Chapter 3. The Town Divided. As the killings continued, Crimson Gulch descended into chaos. The townspeople were divided. Some believed that Blackwood's return was divine justice. They believed that he was an instrument of God sent to punish the guilty and protect the innocent. They called him the Crow Sheriff. They left offerings at his grave. They prayed to him. Others were terrified. They believed that something unholy had returned from the dead. They believed that Blackwood had been corrupted by whatever force had brought him back. They wanted him destroyed, buried again, put to rest permanently. And then there were those who were simply afraid. Afraid that they might be next. Afraid that Blackwood might discover secrets they'd kept hidden. Afraid that the Crow Sheriff might judge them and find them guilty. The town council met to discuss what should be done. The mayor, a man named Edward Thorne, proposed that they exhume Blackwood's grave and destroy his remains. Burn the body, salt the earth, do whatever was necessary to stop the killings.
But the preacher, Reverend William Cross, argued against this plan. He said that Blackwood was doing God's work, that the guilty were being punished and the innocent were being protected. He said that interfering with Blackwood would be interfering with divine justice. The argument became heated, voices were raised, accusations were made, and in the end, the town was split almost evenly between those who wanted to stop Blackwood and those who wanted to let him continue. This division led to violence. Factions formed. The pro-Blackwood faction, which called themselves the Crow's Guard, began to arm themselves. The anti-Blackwood faction, led by Mayor Thorne, did the same. The town that had once been peaceful under Blackwood's protection became a powder keg, ready to explode. And then something happened that changed everything. A young woman named Catherine Wells came forward with a confession. Catherine was the daughter of one of the town's most prominent families. Her father was a banker. Her mother was a respected member of the community. Catherine herself was known as a kind, gentle soul. Everyone in town liked her. But Catherine had a secret. A terrible secret that she'd been carrying for years. When Catherine was 16 years old, she'd been assaulted. A man named Thomas Hendricks, the son of a wealthy rancher, had attacked her in the darkness. He'd raped her, and then he'd threatened to kill her if she told anyone. He'd said that no one would believe her, that his father's money and influence would protect him, that she would be ruined if she came forward. Catherine had stayed silent. She'd suffered in silence for years. She'd watched as Hendricks went on with his life, unpunished, unaccountable. She'd lived with the trauma, the shame, the anger. But then Blackwood returned, and Catherine realized that there was a force in the world that could deliver justice, a force that couldn't be bought or influenced or corrupted. Catherine went to the cemetery at night. She stood at Blackwood's grave, and she told him everything. She told him about Hendricks. She told him about what he'd done to her, and she begged him for justice. 3 nights later, Thomas Hendricks was found dead in his bed. His body was covered in claw marks. His face had been torn apart, and in his hand was a piece of paper. Guilty. But something was different about this killing. This time there was no ambiguity. This time the entire town knew that Hendricks deserved to die. This time even those who'd been opposed to Blackwood's return began to question their position. Catherine's testimony had a profound effect on the townspeople. It opened their eyes to the reality of what Blackwood was doing. He wasn't just randomly killing people. He was targeting those who'd committed real crimes, real injustices, real wrongs that had gone unpunished. The opposition to Blackwood began to crumble. Mayor Thorne found himself increasingly isolated. His faction dwindled as more and more townspeople came to accept, even embrace, the Crow Sheriff's presence. But Thorne wasn't ready to give up. He had a plan, a desperate plan, a plan that would either stop Blackwood or destroy the town in the process. Thorne had discovered something in the town records, something about Blackwood's past, something that gave him an idea. Years ago, before Blackwood came to Crimson Gulch, he'd been involved in an incident in Texas. An incident that never been fully explained. A young woman had died. The official report said it was an accident, but there were rumors that Blackwood had been involved, rumors that he'd been responsible. Thorne decided to investigate these rumors. He sent riders to Texas. He had them dig through old records, interview old-timers, search for the truth about what had happened all those years ago. What they found was shocking. What they found was that Blackwood himself might have been guilty of a crime that had never been prosecuted, a crime that had never been punished. Thorne realized that if Blackwood truly was an instrument of justice, then he would have to judge himself. He would have to confront his own guilt, and perhaps in doing so, he would be destroyed. Thorne gathered the evidence. He prepared his accusation. And then he did something incredibly dangerous. He challenged Blackwood directly. On a night when the Crow sheriff was walking through the streets of Crimson Gulch, surrounded by his flock of crows, Mayor Thorne stepped out into the open. He stood in the middle of the street, and he called out to Blackwood, "I know your secret. I know what you did in Texas. I know about the girl who died. I know that you're guilty. And if you're truly an instrument of justice, then you must judge yourself. You must punish yourself for what you've done." Blackwood stopped. The crows fell silent. For a moment there was complete and utter silence in Crimson Gulch. And then Blackwood turned to face Thorne, and what happened next would determine the fate of the entire town.
Chapter 4. The Reckoning. What Mayor Thorne didn't know was that he'd made a critical error. He'd assumed that Blackwood was unaware of his own past. He'd assumed that the creature that had returned from the grave didn't know about the incident in Texas. But Blackwood knew. Of course he knew. The thing that had returned in Blackwood's body, the entity that had animated his corpse, knew everything about him. It knew his secrets. It knew his sins. It knew his guilt. And it had been waiting for this moment. Blackwood walked toward Thorne, the crows swirling around him in a vortex of black feathers. As he walked, he began to speak, and what he said would change everything. "You're right," Blackwood said, his voice layered and otherworldly. "I am guilty. I have always been guilty. The girl in Texas, her name was Elizabeth. She was innocent, and I was responsible for her death." The townspeople emerged from their homes, drawn by Blackwood's voice. They gathered in the streets, watching, listening as the Crow sheriff confessed his sins. "I was a different man then. I was younger, more arrogant. I thought that I was above the law. I thought that my badge gave me the right to do whatever I wanted. And when Elizabeth rejected my advances, when she refused me, I lost control. I hurt her, and she died." Thorne stood frozen, shocked that his gambit had actually worked. He'd expected Blackwood to deny the accusation, to defend himself. He hadn't expected a confession. "I was never punished for that crime. The local authorities covered it up. My superiors protected me. Money changed hands. Evidence disappeared. And I walked away, free and unpunished. I lived with that guilt for the rest of my life, and when I died, I thought perhaps I would finally find peace." Blackwood stopped a few feet away from Thorne. The crows settled on his shoulders, silent and still. "But there is no peace for the guilty. There is only judgment, and I have been judged." The entity that inhabited Blackwood's body turned its attention inward. The black eyes began to glow with an otherworldly light. The crows began to scream, a sound so piercing and terrible that the townspeople covered their ears. And then something extraordinary happened. The crows began to attack Blackwood. They attacked him with the same fury they'd used against the guilty. They tore at his flesh. They pecked at his face. They drove him to his knees. Blackwood didn't resist. He accepted the punishment. He accepted the judgment. He accepted the justice that was being delivered upon him. As the crows attacked, Blackwood's body began to change. The flesh started to decay at an accelerated rate. The skin withered. The bones became visible. The corpse that had walked among them for weeks began to crumble and fall apart. And as Blackwood's body was destroyed, something else happened. The crows began to change. Their black feathers turned white. Their screams became almost musical. They transformed from instruments of vengeance into something else, something pure, something almost angelic. The white birds rose into the air, carrying with them the last remnants of Blackwood's corpse. They flew upward, higher and higher, until they disappeared into the night sky. When they were gone, there was nothing left. No body, no trace of the Crow Sheriff, just empty air where a man had stood moments before. The townspeople stood in stunned silence. They'd witnessed something that transcended their understanding of the world. They'd seen justice delivered in a way that was both terrible and beautiful. They'd seen a man confront his own guilt and accept his own punishment. Mayor Thorne fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. He'd come to Crimson Gulch seeking to stop the Crow Sheriff. Instead, he'd witnessed something that had changed him fundamentally. He'd witnessed the power of justice, the power of accountability, the power of confronting one's own sins. In the days that followed, Crimson Gulch began to heal. The violence stopped. The divisions that had torn the town apart began to mend. People came forward with their own confessions, their own secrets, their own guilt, and they began the process of seeking forgiveness and redemption. But something had changed in the town, something fundamental. The people of Crimson Gulch had learned a lesson that most people never learn. They'd learned that justice, true justice, requires confronting not just the guilt of others, but one's own guilt as well. They'd learned that accountability is not something that can be escaped or avoided. They'd learned that in the end, we are all judged by our own actions. And they'd learned that sometimes the dead don't rest. Sometimes the dead return to teach us lessons we desperately need to learn.
Chapter 5. The Aftermath. In the years that followed the events of 1885, Crimson Gulch became known throughout the frontier as a town of justice and redemption. The story of the Crow Sheriff spread from town to town, from saloon to saloon, becoming legend. Some versions of the story portrayed Blackwood as a vengeful ghost, a spirit seeking revenge on those who'd wronged him. Other versions portrayed him as an angel of justice, sent by God to punish the wicked. And still other versions suggested that he was something far stranger and more complex, a being caught between life and death, between justice and vengeance, between the earthly and the divine. The truth, as is often the case, was more nuanced than any single version of the story. What we know for certain is that the killings stopped after Blackwood's final confrontation with Mayor Thorne. No more bodies were found. No more pieces of paper bearing the word guilty appeared. The Crow Sheriff was gone. But his legacy remained. The people of Crimson Gulch used the lessons they'd learned to transform their town. They established a more rigorous system of justice. They created a town council that was truly representative of the community. They worked to ensure that crimes didn't go unpunished and that the guilty couldn't escape accountability through corruption or influence. Catherine Wells, the young woman who'd been assaulted by Thomas Hendricks, became an advocate for justice. She worked with other victims of crimes that had gone unpunished. She helped them find closure and healing. She became a voice for those who'd been silenced by fear or shame. Mayor Thorne underwent a profound transformation. He spent the rest of his life working to make amends for the corruption and injustice that had occurred under his watch. He stepped down as mayor and spent his final years as a teacher, educating the next generation about the importance of justice and accountability. Reverend William Cross, who'd supported Blackwood's return, used the experience to deepen his faith. He preached about redemption and judgment, about the power of confronting one's own sins, about the possibility of transformation, even in the darkest circumstances. The cemetery where Blackwood had been buried became a place of pilgrimage. People came from all over the frontier to visit his grave. Some came seeking justice. Some came seeking guidance. Some came simply to pay their respects to a man who died in service to his town and had returned to complete that service in a way that transcended death itself. But perhaps most interesting are the reports that continued to come in throughout the frontier. Reports of a figure surrounded by crows appearing in towns where injustice had taken root. Reports of guilty men and women meeting mysterious ends. Reports of the Crow Sheriff continuing his work even after his apparent destruction in Crimson Gulch. Some say that Blackwood never truly died, that he simply moved on to other towns, other injustices, other guilty parties who needed to be judged. And some say that if you listen carefully enough on certain nights, you can hear the sound of crows cawing in the darkness. And if you listen even more carefully, you might hear a voice beneath those caws, a voice that sounds almost like Sheriff Thomas Blackwood, a voice that says, "Justice is not finished. The guilty will be punished, and I will be the instrument of that punishment." Whether these reports are true or simply folklore, we may never know. But what we do know is that the story of the Crow Sheriff of Crimson Gulch has endured for over a century. It has been told and retold, adapted and reimagined, but the core message has remained the same. Justice, true justice, is not something that can be escaped or avoided. It is not something that can be bought or influenced or corrupted. And sometimes, when the law fails, when the system breaks down, justice comes from unexpected places. Justice comes from the dead. Justice comes in the form of a sheriff and his flock of crows. Justice comes from beyond the grave.
Epilogue. The mystery remains. The story of the Crow Sheriff of Crimson Gulch raises questions that we may never be able to answer. Was Thomas Blackwood truly resurrected? Was he possessed by some supernatural entity? Or was the entire event a manifestation of the town's collective guilt and desire for justice? The scientific explanation would suggest mass hysteria, psychological phenomena amplified by grief, guilt, and the harsh conditions of frontier life. The deaths could be attributed to natural causes, to accidents, to coincidences. But the evidence suggests something more. The accounts are too consistent. The details are too specific. The transformations in the town are too profound. What we do know is that Crimson Gulch changed after 1885. It became a place where justice was valued, where accountability was expected, where the guilty could not hide behind money or influence or power. Whether that change was brought about by a supernatural force or by the townspeople's own desire for redemption, the result was the same. Crimson Gulch became better. The people became better, and the legacy of the Crow Sheriff endured. Today, Crimson Gulch is a ghost town like so many others in the American West. The buildings are abandoned, the streets are empty, the people have moved on. But locals say that if you visit Crimson Gulch at night, if you stand in the cemetery and listen carefully, you might hear something. You might hear the sound of crows cawing. You might see shadows moving between the buildings. You might feel a presence watching you, judging you. And if you're guilty of something, if you've committed a crime that's gone unpunished, if you've escaped justice through corruption or luck or the simple failure of the law to catch you, well, you might want to be very careful about visiting Crimson Gulch after dark. Because the Crow Sheriff might still be watching, and he might decide that it's time for justice to be served. This has been Mysteries of the Old West. Thank you for joining us as we explored the darkness of America's frontier. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation into the paranormal mysteries of the Old West. Until next time, stay safe, stay skeptical, and remember, some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some debts are better left unpaid. But in Crimson Gulch, justice always comes due. The crows are watching.